Good evening, everybody. Just going to get a quick thumbs up if you can hear me. I know most of you are muted, but I see thumbs. That's a great start. So welcome. We're going to start on time, as you would expect for a meetup like this. So the first thing I have to say is thank you for signing up for this. This is our inaugural session, and it's not the location I had in mind, I'll be honest. This was going to be in central London, and this was going to be in a big room where we could all meet and chat to each other and have a beer. Obviously, the pivot has happened, and I'm delighted that we could still do it virtually. It's super exciting. So this is our new meetup, and it's Agile Leadership and Business Agility. So we're going to be talking about all things leadership. We're going to be talking about business agility, and that's going to be a very, very broad base of stuff. So we're going to be bringing together a whole bunch of things, and I'm excited to be starting this, and it's great that we've had such a great turnout for the first one. So thank you for joining. I'm not going to talk for long. I'm going to do my thing, and then I'm going to hand over to our speaker, because that's what you've all come for. Okay, firstly, my name's Kareem. Sorry, I should have introduced myself. I'm Kareem from Agile Center, who's hosting this. The first thing I want to say is about Zoom etiquette. All right, so you've joined muted. If you can remain muted while Perry's speaking, that would be really great, just so I never know what noises you're going to have in the background, so we can try and stay on mute. But we want to see you. So if you can turn on your videos. I know we've all got corona hair, right? But we want to see faces. We want to make some connections. So if you're happy to do that, then please let us see you, and that will be really great. Okay. And the final thing is, feel free to use chat to ping Agile Center some questions. We're not going to answer them. Perry's going to answer them, but we'll be collecting those questions as we go and feeding them to Perry at the end. We want you to get your questions answered. So if you have questions, there's nothing to stop us diving into those in the middle of the session. But if you could ping them to Agile Center on the chat, that would be really helpful, just privately, and we can collect those. Okay, that's all I want to say. I want to turn over now to Perry, because I think he's got a great session for us, as you can see. He's going to be doing his thing for between 40 minutes and 60 minutes, depending on how long these things go. All right, so Perry's background actually started off in the civil service. And was a user of IT systems, including the old COBOL mainframe systems, and that's something we have in common, because I started my career actually coding in COBOL, building mainframe systems. Those were the good old days, some 17 years ago. All right. He found Scrum in early 2000s, so potentially before the manifesto was written there, so a real early adopter. And was drawn to the intersection between self-managing systems and product development, and it just kind of really brought everything together that he'd been doing. Okay? His background is organizational design and HR, so he's coming at Agile from an HR perspective, which is incredible, because we've ignored HR for so long, and given individuals and interactions is the first line of the manifesto. I think that it's great that HR is now really coming to the forefront. Okay, he's an author of transformational HR, and he's a TEDx speaker, and he's just a thought leader in this space. So I'm super, super delighted that Perry can join us today. Really, really happy he's here. I'm going to shut up and go away and hand over to Perry. Perry, over to you, my friend.
Thanks very much, Kareem. That's a lovely introduction. And yeah, I can remember vividly those COBOL days where we used to have a secure area where you had to literally have a body search and everything to go into that one terminal that was powering all those banks of tape drives. And as you say, I was a user at the time, and I was kind of like the end user. And then I got to be a user in projects. So I got Prince 2 qualification in project management and stuff. And even back in those days, I was like, what is this clunky methodology where you spend so much time processing your own sort of paperwork and not doing the actual thing? So so my background is definitely one of a fascination of this intersection between projects, people and technology. So yeah, I'm gonna jump in and share screen so I can run through my slides, and hopefully it might even raise a bit of a chuckle, that sort of opening line: Agile in HR, OD, as you say, organization design, development and change. And I've called it look out technologists, here come the peopleists. because I think it has been a super best kept secret without people wanting to hide it. But it hasn't infiltrated places like HR. And so Kareem mentioned the book I wrote in 2017, Transformational HR. And at that time, there weren't that many people in HR who knew what Agile meant. If you asked them what Agile working meant, they would talk to you about hot desking and remote working and flexible timescales, a bit like we're all doing now with our Corona here and our dispersed working. But I was so fascinated by it, and as Kareem says, I've been looking into self-managed teams and systems for quite some time and been fascinated by the different dynamic and the adaptability that was shown by those organisations. I thought we can't just leave it to Silicon Valley pioneers or the places of work like you hear about Zappos or Morningstar tomato processing out in California. And I thought this is something that should be mainstream, and I'm hoping to try and put it together in that way. So just a little bit about me. The company name doesn't stand for my initials, but it's a kind of play on it. It's People and Transformational HR, which is probably why I got asked to write the book. What we stand for is better business for a better world. And I think that's the essence of what we're trying to do. We're trying to create situations where people don't dread that whole thing that is work and tolerate some really painful experience that's torture, live for the weekends and for their 2-week vacations, but actually something that is a definition of who they are, and they live fulfilling lives because their work is an integral part of how they feel in terms of satisfaction and achievement in life. I've seen it, I know it exists, I just want to proliferate it. And as a result of doing that, I've been able to achieve a few kind of landmarks, I suppose, in the career sense. I've made a few lists, as Kareem says, written a couple of books, and pop up at a few management schools and even teach some of this stuff now as part of curriculums for HR and MBAs. And the company vision, a connected collaborative enterprise of conscious business activists. So we're very much into this organisation with a conscience and a soul. And we spend a lot of time looking at human-centred systems that help HR do its thing. Kareem, you're right. We've ignored HR for too long, but it's been too easy to ignore HR unless you're in trouble or there's something wrong with your payslip. And so we want to reinvent that so that it's a driving force within business and change. We're up to 21st century org design because we're still seeing far too much of the world of work stuck in the 20th century kind of mechanistic tailorist paradigm. So we want to upgrade that work operating system. And agile, inclusive and self-managed ways of working that we believe are going to be the powerhouse behind how things change. And I guess in the kind of crazy situation we find ourselves in with everybody dispersed, if you're in a knowledge work situation or suddenly, you're an underpaid but now christened key worker, we've got some really interesting shifts going on about how we look at people and the work they do. We've got our own manifesto. It's not quite as succinct as the Agile manifesto, but we want to create this sense of doing good through work and not just profiteering. And so we explicitly state in our principles autonomous, aligned, agile ways of working where people collaborate, learn and flourish together. There's genuinely this sense that, especially now we're in isolation, that togetherness is probably something we have underrated and almost abused perhaps in the past. And it's where I've seen scrums and agile teams have a totally different frame of togetherness that I think has really endeared us to this way of working. And so it's become a bit of a signature trait of ours when we're trying to help organizations change, adapt and pivot. These are the places that ask us to come in and help. So ranging from, in the top left corner, Blackwood Homes, who look after vulnerable adults who want to live an independent life, down to the bottom right-hand corner, a telecoms company down in Sudan, through to some councils, some of our NHS heroes, some energy, retail, financial systems, and we're currently working on a large-scale globalized project with BT to introduce self-management to a group of engineers in the field. So we're getting to play with some interesting spaces, I guess you'd say. So I've called it an agile evolution in HR, for want of a better phrase, and I think it's all this changing world of work stuff that happened even before coronavirus, where we would see people talk about automation and the hollowing out of the middle of organizations. We would be talking about about gig working, we would be talking about robotics entering into certain fields. And I guess what I saw at the advent of this whole future of work sort of frame of reference, an HR system that was still very much about process and about rigidity and about conservatism and governance heavy. And so we wanted to help create this responsive people profession. And what backs it up is some of this. So OC Tanner is a long-established family business based in Utah, but now global, who look after the concept of recognition and achievement in the workplace. And they do some research every year, and I think this research is probably going to chime with many of you, where we are seeing 79% of employees suffering from mild, moderate or severe burnout, and 40% of employees are experiencing moderate or severe burnout. So we've got a definite sense that there are a lot of people who are unhealthy in the way work is done, and some of that is the clash, I think, between 21st century aspirations that people have and the needs they have, and the 20th century kind of work paradigm. Sticking with that research, the leadership element that Karine mentioned, there's definitely something about a crisis that we're seeing, where 1 out of 5 of us will report that our leader is expressing doubts about their capability. So I guess you could say that 4 of us seem to be doing okay, but 1 out of 5 of us is working in a climate of fear and uncertainty, and doesn't have the belief and the backing of their leader. 44% of employees feel their leader works to develop them. So that means there's a big fat 56% of people who are saying their leader doesn't do anything to advance their career, to give them confidence, to stretch their capability and give them future career options. That's a bit of a sad statistic too. 26% of employees feel their leader strongly encourages collaboration, which means a huge 74% don't. And it seems a complete and utter anathema that we've got 3/4 of the leader population who don't even recognise and value collaboration, when you hear that rhetoric regularly talked about when people are trying to position themselves as an employer of choice. And over half of employees feel their leader would not give up control over anything. So I think we've got this grip, this vice-like grip of 20th century management technology that's holding us back. And when I look at this kind of statistic, and then I look at organisations that are much more inclusive, that are much more agile, I'm hoping that we'll see a significant shift in that over the coming years, perhaps enforced by our dispersed and remote working. And when we look at individuals, this same research was able to report out on 6 traits that people said they wanted from their work to be able to operate in a way that's much more agile, perhaps with a small a, rather than a sort of methodology and approach, large a. Flexibility in schedule, a say in projects worked on, flexibility in where they work, their ability to prioritise their own workload, a high degree of latitude for innovation, and the freedom to be creative. These all seem to be the factors that people would say would give their work a stronger sense of fulfillment, accomplishment, achievement, and wouldn't have them going home at the end of the day exhausted and wondering what their efforts actually resulted in. But it seems that the more people are trying to assert those as aspirations, the more the work operating system is saying, we want compliance, we want certainty, we want high productivity. We don't have time for this messy stuff where we're not really sure what the direct causality is between how you are and the quality of the work that you do. So I think individually and collectively, we have some systems that are just completely misfiring. And my profession, HR and organisation design, has a lot to do with that. I don't think we've been bold enough in challenging some of those constructs of the 20th century as we've headed into the 21st. And so onto another bit of research from Deloitte. Every year they do a human capital research piece. And in 2017 and 2019, there were 2 recurring themes. The first one was around the shape of the organisation, and the diagram on the left gives you a sense of how most HR people would articulate the design of an organisation. Hierarchy with people in functional roles, different levels of accountability, responsibility, and of course pay grade, and a sense of ownership within those functional silos. And what Deloitte's research found is that a lot of companies were restructuring those functional hierarchies and perhaps working much more cross-discipline. Unfortunately, I've also been not only a sort of a victim of Prince 2 project management, but I've also been a victim of matrix management, where all you tend to do is have confusion with 3 or 4 bosses to try and operate under at the same time. But I think what we're seeing now with this diagram on the right is where teams come together to work on a product or a solution. And so you may come from marketing, user experience, risk and compliance, engineering, or customer data, but you come together, you work as a cross-disciplinary team, you have a start, middle, and an end. You will probably disassemble on completion of your product or your solution, and you'll reassemble in a different format with different people to solve a different problem. And if you're experienced in Agile and Scrum, you're like, well, yeah, that's just what you do. But HR still has a fixation that the sort of home base and the operational division is pretty much where all your work gets done. And I think it's now being sort of bust open as a myth. And the ADP research that's mentioned on there talks about 64% of employees working on more than one team. We have a docking station, and we are basically orbiting satellites that come together in different formations. But I think what's probably most telling about the Deloitte Human Capital research is that it recognised that high-performing organisations are increasingly showing their agility and speed to market by using the small team network construct. So fractal structures, holocratic circles, however you want to describe it, but they're recognising the trait of a high-performing organisation is one that's nimble and can adapt and move because it's made of a network of small teams. So with the writing on the wall in a structural sense, we can also look at the, I guess, psychological contract elements that are at play within organisations. And this is very much how people feel and the mental models and the, I guess, prevailing senses of control that are present within organisations. And so we're on the sort of bottom slide, you've got autonomy, and then alongside the left, you've got alignment. And so what I think is going on here is where there's low autonomy and low alignment, people are transacting their way through their work, and it is very much an enforced regime by management where you're told what to do, no compromise, heavily scrutinised, managed to within an inch of your life type stuff. And if we go up a bit on that scale to the high alignment but still low autonomy, that's probably where a lot of people feel they operate. They're told what to do, but they know why they do it. So they're managed, and they're perhaps more directed than they are sort of punitively managed. And some people have operated in that space and gone, I've heard about this self-management stuff. It sounds really good. I can be less busy as a manager. I'm just going to loosen the grip of control and let people do what they want. And then we see the move down to the high autonomy, low alignment piece, where people do what they want. It's determined by self, it's unmanaged, but potentially it's not exactly what's needed for the team, the business, the customers, or whatever it is. So the sweet spot is in the top right, where it's self-managed and directed by self, but people are given guidance on what to do. So it's highly linked to a key corporate priority or a customer need or a new market venture that's going to help the company expand and diversify. And so this is where innovation happens. This is where people have a sense of agency and influence over their work, and things like creativity and diversity of thought are valued much more than compliance and rigorous governance-based systems. So that, I think, is the sort of psychological frame that we're starting to see some companies recognizing is a shift they want to make. And so, why is Agile then so important for an HR function? HR talks a lot about evidence. HR doesn't talk very much about experimentation, and HR doesn't talk enough about energy either. So we are obsessed with, well, what's the precedent for it? What's the legal implications for it? And very risk averse in how to change. And what we see in Agile senses is that evidence is revealed through sprints and MVPs and prototypes and iterations that are part of an experimentation routine and are quite high energy giving in terms of people seeing progress and being able to adapt a product and learn as they are building the concept. Creativity, inclusion and pace. HR talks a lot about inclusion and tends to look at it from a realm of protected characteristics such as race, gender, faith, ethnicity, that sort of thing, and tries its best, I think, to be creative with using new recruitment techniques, perhaps some video hiring, and I guess isn't renowned for its pace. Often the nature of an HR project and a restructure is perhaps a good example, is that it probably takes the best part of a year to get a company from one shape to another shape, quite painfully, quite sort of fraught with uncertainty and a bit of trauma for people involved in it. And again, one of the things that I think we need to see is a much quicker response system from HR. And then alignment, autonomy and accountability are things which are supposedly built into job descriptions. But again, there's a bit of a myth that a job description is anything other than a useful recruiting tool. I don't think there are many people who would describe their weekly activities and pin them back to their job description. So I think in the red box we talk about qualities, competencies and behaviours, but they're in deficit across the people profession. So with the greatest respect to my own peers, I think we're in a situation where we've got some very learnt habits that I think we need to unlearn and start to relearn something that I think the Agile community has been operating in for quite some time. And so how does it work then in HR and OD? I mean, that's really what I'm going to sort of unpack for you. So yes, we've got a recognition of some of the tools, rituals and methods that I guess if you're an Agile practitioner or you're a Scrum Master and you've been involved in this for quite some time from a technology and product development perspective, you'll recognise, and you'll also go, what did he do there? Because there are some hacks and some adaptations within it, because we're trying to land it in an environment which isn't about the production of a platform or an application or you know, helping people clear their sort of stacks and containers. And so we've then got how we build it into a strategy. I think the good thing about most people who are adopting Agile, a change organisation design kind of approach, is that they're building it into an overarching strategy that includes things like innovation, inclusion, and a responsiveness to 21st century needs. I'll talk to you about some of my clients a bit later, but particularly working in healthcare, charity, and in the government sector, austerity has cut quite significantly, not just their resource, but just their capacity to innovate. And yet the demands on all of those operations are increasing, diversifying and getting more complex. So they find themselves with less resource and they find themselves with competing demands. And so what we try and do when we work with clients is make sure that strategically what they're doing is they're trying to minimize their own bureaucracy, they're trying to sharpen their own sense of productivity, and they're doing that through a method that can be iterated and adapted and responsive to that changing need. So we like to see Agile not just launched and landed within an organization, but a key part of a farther-reaching strategy of intent. And so let's get into some of the mechanics of it. And so one of the things we found when we've worked with companies, and particularly the HR teams, which is often where we're commissioned, is that they've already got a big project bucket list. They've got lots of things they want to do, a new graduate scheme, they want to work more flexibly for parents and carers, those kind of things. And so they tend to have them all on the wish list, and they rarely get around to doing them because they're often stuck in the sort of groove of dealing with business as usual. And so what we first do is try and have a bit of a clear out. So we have a look at that project backlog and we start to give them some definition. And you'll see from here, some of them find themselves in a more fixed formal project management role. And this is where things like legislation have to be complied with. And so you can't really hack when you have to do formal consultation about redundancy schemes or relocation. There is a legal procedure to follow, there are deadlines that are unmovable, and so we look at those and say, well, those are your fixed bucket of projects. We then look at some that could be a mixture, so the hybrid type of approach, and that's more about adaptive. So we look at something like a talent development program. So we could design it very agile, since we could bring product thinking into the space, we could bring users in to help us craft the stories and build a solution that's right for them. And then maybe it's deployed in a fixed way because it has to be rolled out, it has to be sort of governed by other parameters. So we'll create this hybrid version that sits in between. And then we have a whole bucket list that could be agile, and so we tend to create an enormous amount of energy and vitality and pace around projects that would sit in that area. And so that could be something like people wanting to grow their digital learning footprint, which I guess everybody's doing right now, where we can start to think about how we can build small and iterate and craft and bring users in and adapt and not sort of have some behind the scenes thing going on for 6 months and then launch it and it's a spectacular failure. So yeah, so that's what we do. We rationalize projects. What we found is that where people are mostly working on an agile project, we can see 4 times faster in terms of concept to implementation. We see 100% hit rate on more inclusive and innovative approaches, so we get a better product out of it. We get more diversity of thought and more people who step in to help HR do this. And we find a lot more evidence and research that sits in those kind of projects, because we're revealing evidence as we're testing our prototypes and building our MVPs. The hybrid projects still tend to be faster than the sort of slower participants, 2x faster on that one, where we can shorten certain areas to use Agile much more responsively, and so that's a benefit in terms of speed and resource. And we find the lowest proportion of projects that HR has in its bucket list is these fixed ones, these big ones that are absolutely pinned to things like legislation. So we purge and we create a sense of urgency, I guess, that helps people understand what kind of projects and what kind of problems they're trying to solve. And so this is our timeline. This is how we end up helping people understand from start to finish, once we've got an agile project in mind and we're working in HR, OD and complex areas like leadership and culture, how it works. One of the first things we found, almost like a huge penny drop moment, is the concept of a product owner. So we go into organizations and we often say, okay, so you want a new graduate scheme? Yeah. We want to increase the diversity of our pool of graduate applicants? Yeah. So the problem is they're not diverse enough now? Yep. So who owns that problem? And they'll say, well, it's a board strategic goal. So the board own it. And we straight away kind of outlaw that shared responsibility, because we want one person who can stand in that space and say, that product is mine. When you deliver that product, I'm going to be the person who will stand in it, make it work. If it needs adaptation, I'll sanction that. If it fails, I'll stand in that space and say why. And if it succeeds and we win awards, I'll be the first one to rush up onto stage. So we find a single product owner, and that concept is a very difficult one to land, actually, because most people like to hide behind a committee, a focus group, a body, and like I say, a board. So we straight away draw that one out, and we get people to stand in that space and own that product. And unlike Scrum, we don't have the product owner in the Scrum helping us build it. With this, we keep the product owner as a sort of distant leader. We keep them as a sort of client who has commissioned us to do the work, but doesn't actually do the work themselves, because we want autonomy, diversity of thought. We don't want a hierarchical kind of over management aspect to be brought into this. So with that in mind, we then go out to the populace in the organization and we say, right, who wants to work on this? And so we urge people to volunteer and opt in. And again, this is counterintuitive to particularly most HR projects, because most HR projects are, well, let's make sure we've got finance on, let's get risk and legal involved, let's get a business partner involved, and let's get learning development. No, we don't do that. We say, who out there wants to come in to this space and environment and help us build it? And people will often say, well, you know, I'm not of a particular grade. I haven't got a particular type of experience. I really want to help put this product together, but I'm not sure that I've got the experience or the ranking to warrant and to justify it. And we start from the point that intent is the best way to build a team, because they have the energy and the commitment and the focus to deliver something. And so we go along that line. And we always get senior leaders who say, yeah, but what if they get to financial modelling and they don't know how to do financial modelling? We get the squad or the scrum or the team to recognise their own deficiencies and to use their own internal network to then find the person with that skill and capability, commission them to do a specific piece of work and bring that back into the product cycle, so that we don't graft in a finance person who sits there quiet for 90% of the time and then only comes to life when the budget section comes up. We keep it on enthusiasts, we keep it on high energy, high intent people. And so far, our results have proven that that actually helps pace creativity and builds a sense of agency, that people don't have to have knowledge. They can go and source it from within the rest of the organization. And we don't create an obese project structure where we've got 35 people just because you want to keep everybody happy at all parts of the process. We get somebody to stand in the space as a coach so that they are almost acting like a bit of a pseudo scrum master. They're there to facilitate the team, to help them focus on priorities, to clear blockages and to remove obstacles. So they're very much commissioned by the scrum or the squad, but they're also there to help create the kind of handrails and the safety and the direction, I suppose, without being a project manager. And we deliberately try and keep them light on documentation. We try not to even get them into red, amber, green type reports. We get them into the stand-up philosophy. We get them into using roadmaps. We get them into using high visibility working so that anytime people want to, they can check out backlogs. So we try and recruit, bring in a sense of reduced bureaucracy in this. Of course, we know when we need to deliver it, the product owner will set a deadline. That might be because there's, kind of a looming piece of legislation that drives it, or there may just be a real intent to get something in by a certain period in time. And the team get together and start to build the product story based on the product owner's vision, and they'll get that checked out by the product owner and sign off that. And again, in an HR sense, I don't think people had ever talked about putting a product story together. If they wanted to introduce a new policy for a graduate scheme, they'd probably cut and paste it. They might source their network and get a few examples, smash it together and just push that out, hope it's the right thing to do. We also spend a lot of time obsessing about who the product's for. And again, I'm hoping to most of you listening to this, you're like, well, duh, of course so. Your user stories are pretty much what drives your product and your features and ensures that there's a successful resolution at the end of this. But again, in HR, bless us, we've had an approach that, a policy is a good policy. People find their way through it and that's it. We've rarely taken the end user's perspective in mind. And so when some people say, oh, I didn't know I couldn't claim overtime for that because the policy's a bit big and confusing, we're like, tough, it's a policy. Whereas actually, if we really wanted to build something like an overtime policy that was helpful to people, we would model it based on a number of different users who were frequent overtime users, infrequent overtime users, part-time people claiming overtime. And we would build a policy from a very, very different perspective. And I think this has been the biggest kind of clonk moment for HR people to kind of go, oh yeah, I'm doing it for people, aren't I? And it sounds crazy, but the user of an HR product has rarely come in mind. Even my time in learning and development, we would often just call them learners. And it's like, yeah, the learners come into the classroom and the learners get given some PowerPoint stuff and the learners get an exercise. And it's almost like, well, are they coming at it with the same experience? Do they all have the same sort of preferred style of how they want to kind of take in content and then learn and adapt and experience something? So I think we've got a really strong sort of capability gap to close there, but user stories are really, really helping us. We adopt the backlog of tasks process. So we create the product story, we come up with a product backlog, and then we start to go into users, and then we can create sprint backlogs. And so people get very familiar with the fact that what they're trying to do is just predict enough of the task list to get them from sprint 1 to sprint 2, and maybe they've got a few more that would see them through to the deadline, but we don't obsess about absolutely every single task being imagined at the outset. We work on that sort of iterative process, and that's given a real sense of momentum, focus and adaptation that I think was much needed in an HR world. Get them onto sprints, get them to understand how they set the duration of sprints, how they use retrospectives, and how they can plan a cycle and adapt and carry over and review. And at the end, we then conduct a project retrospective. And whilst it's almost like something when I joined the learning and development team that you would have like a training course evaluation, HR hasn't been that good at looking back and saying, well, if we did this again, what would we do differently? What were the big things that kind of hampered us most? And how did we behave? And what could we learn about the next time we come together on this one? So I think that's given us a real sense of punctuation in our process. And so again, when I've seen teams from HR and learning in OD who've used this methodology, the retrospective has been an incredible breath of fresh air to like, we teach people how to learn, but we haven't really been learning ourselves about how we are approaching the work that we do. And then we build the product. And even the word product has sometimes become a point of conjecture because the HR community is used to thinking we don't have any products. It's like, well, yes, you do, because there are people who use things, who need to know certain information, they locate it and they use that as part of a process chain. So that product language has actually created a little disturbance in people thinking, oh yeah, I do build products and people do use them and they do have features and they all have different needs. So I think that's been a real sort of breath of fresh air in unlocking this sense that it's just a workforce and a group of people into individuals with characteristics, traits, needs, variables, and so on. So that's a kind of total unpack of the process, which I'm hoping you're sort of pretty familiar with. And we try and bring it into that sense of balance as well. So we will have sprints within it, but if there are formal sort of projects that are connected to it, we'll have a segue between the two. And often people say, well, what about the governance, and what about the rigor, and what about the legal? And we work with as much space as we can to use Agile and comply where we absolutely have to. Strategic and operational fit. So this is often where people say, well, if you join an Agile team and it's not your day job, what happens to your day job? Are you on the Agile team all the time? Do you sort of move between the two? And our short answer to that is, well, it depends. But our longer answer is that as a team of people looking at an Agile project, you work out the rhythm of whether you are spending every Thursday on an Agile project, or whether you're doing 2 hours a day in each morning and spreading it out between your existing workloads, or whether indeed it does need to co-opt you from your base into an Agile squad or team. And then we talk about the models and the tools that we use within it. And as you'll see later on, we are paying homage to quite a few of the tools that are used in Scrum and Agile, but we're bringing them into HR and OD projects. And so these are the main players: the product owner, the Agile coach, and the Agile teams or squads. These are the ones who are taking these sort of project threads and work requirements and building them through to product and solution. Even if it isn't an app or a platform or anything, it's a policy or a new scheme or a recruitment method, an assessment center, or whatever it might be. And we do get them to start with a problem statement. So if you're a big fan of problem statements, if you use those quite a lot before you enter into the Agile process, we often take our sort of HR and leadership colleagues back and say, you want culture change? What's the problem you're trying to solve? And so we try and introduce this kind of frame to give us a sense of a really strong project brief and a real mandate that is fixed around a problem that's occurring. So if there is a management training course that's getting low take-up, then we want to look at the problem statement from that kind of perspective. You know, when management training is designed, I want it to be relevant to me right now so that I can action that kind of stuff, but I can't get on it quickly enough, and I have to find my way through accident and design and perhaps a little bit of mentoring. So there's a problem then about the timing, and maybe there's a problem about the format of the learning that's trying to service a new manager's needs. So the problem statement thing has helped certainly my HR and org design colleagues get right into the thick of what's actually the causal trail behind the fact that you've got some work to put right or to do or to create something better. So we try and give that as a very sort of strong steer as an early part in our process. So we use product stories. So we help people by saying, you know, you might not use HR in HR language like a product story, but we want you to, so that you can detach from your current way of thinking about how you put a program of learning together and start talking about it as a product that people are consuming. So we give them some questions to help them build that sort of methodology. And in the pre-corona world, we would probably do this in a room with people who'd volunteered with a problem already identified, and we start to then talk about the product and the story behind it. Give that a nice narrative illustration. That gets people quite animated and quite excited because they can really see what it is they're building, not just some piece of paper or some update to the intranet. And then this is where we really, really go deep and heavy on the user stories. So who's going to use it? What stories can you create about that? Who might influence its use, but who might obstruct its use? So we try and get people to think not just at the core user, but those peripheral users. And so if it's a management development program, then clearly the core users are people with an intent to become a manager. But there may be some people out there who feel a sense of entitlement to management development, who don't feel it's for them, and they might try and obstruct how this is used. They might not be an active mentor. They might sabotage somebody who's brought in to sort of manage them if they're on some kind of assignment. So we try and use the hypothesis as a user, I want so that. and give them a sense of how to create that in a culture, leadership, or HR sort of product environment. And we create a backlog, we get them to start listing tasks, and of course we would have done this in the classic agile way of post-it notes and whiteboards and big space, but get people to start thinking, well, what do I need? And people often sort of say, we need a comms plan, a stakeholder map, and a launch strategy. It's like, great, okay, that's 3 pretty big things, but what sits behind that? Who's your communication plan for? How regularly do you need to do it? What format? What platforms? What about people hard to reach? What about people who are on maternity leave? All that kind of stuff. So we get them to really, really unpack it and not just think at a high superficial level that they would expect to see on some Gantt chart. So we give them the sense of what they're up against and how much time and effort they'll need to use. We've even started to introduce into this some kind of time boxing, and we've sort of used the extreme programming sort of model where we say, is it half an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, 16 hours, 32 hours, 64 hours, or whatever it is. And so just to give a sense of the velocity and the nature of the resource requirement. We get them to map it out on a product canvas. So we say, who are your users, primary and secondary? What kind of goals are you trying to achieve? So a big narrative type description of what the thing is aiming to do. And then some metrics of when you're going to do it and what will success look like and what are the value and impact based criteria you can identify now and that will work up and adapt and improve on as we go through. We put features in and we just give them a bit of a scratch pad for any details that might give them a sense of what else they might want to put in the mix. Some non-mandatory features which might be quite nice to put in if they have the time, a further iteration once this first version has been released. And so we try and give people a sense that on one page, if anybody says, well, what's this thing you're working on? They've got a really strong narrative of who it's for, what it's aiming to achieve, how they'll measure it, and what the features are that would bring it to life. Really important kind of distillation process that I think was missing from HR projects in the past. And we use sprint planning. So we ask people to think about 4, 5, 6 sprints, weekly, bi-weekly, whatever it might be, and there's no real sort of strong answer that we leave people with. It's almost like, well, look at your tasks, look at the resource and the amount of effort put into it, and start to plan your sprints based on that. And we use Kanban boards, so we get them to either use Trello or something, but we adopt the classic to do, doing, and done. And again, what's interesting here is the kind of, I suppose, rule of Kanban boards that, you know, a member of the team is allowed to be taking something from the to-do column to doing one thing at a time, and they can only pick another one when that's moved into the done column. And that sense of rigor is actually quite highly impacted on people. I've even heard of HR people going back to their kids and saying, right, I'm going to put you chores on a Kanban board. So this has really sort of taken them to a new level of proficiency, I suppose, on how to tackle things and how to do them. So some people are using Trello, some are using other applications, some people are using whiteboards and very open sort of areas. But this has proven to be a really good way of looking at effort and looking at progress and so on. So again, not a revelation to those of you probably connected to this, but in the HR world, it's helped us look at what progress really does look like. And we do love a roadmap, so we really help them try and think about either sprint cycles or development cycles and put together a roadmap so that we can see a pathway of where things could be, and obviously keep coming back to the roadmap and updating it and adapting it and building it out so that we don't get those horrendous Gantt charts that even if you print them on huge paper are likely to make your eyes bleed trying to read them, and therefore people don't use them. We tend to use this roadmap as a real sense of what are we up against, when do we need to do stuff, how do we apportion resource and effort. And then the story of Salford. So this is a local government organisation that for about 3 years was desperate to enhance its kind of digital service provision to the citizens of Salford. And they were really struggling to get things right and get things out and get things used. And so in the bottom with the blonde hair and the grey jacket is Debbie Brown, who's the transformation director, and sat to her right is Sam Betts, who was the HR director, who heard me speak about self-management and scrums and agile and thought this is what they need. Anyway, the long and the short of this story is we came in and worked on a sort of strategic alignment piece with them, so it fitted the overall agenda for Salford as an organisation. We brought in about 100 people into rooms, giving them real problems and working them through the Agile cycle within that room, about 3 hours worth of training. They set themselves up into squads. They brought people in to coach the squads. They had a very strong leaning towards products. And within 6 months of that particular exercise, they won Digital Council of the Year because they launched 8 very successful, highly taken up products that completely changed how citizens could interact with Salford. And they've now taken that to largely anything and everything to do with how Salford as a council works. And coronavirus response has also been used this way, so that they've had volunteers. They set up a drive-through testing station in under 48 hours. They deployed all of their office-based staff to work from home and had a technology kit delivered and installed for them within 48 hours. They developed an app, which was online help for using technology in a dispersed way within 48 hours. And they swear they would have been nowhere near that had they not already become very used to agile, responsive and adaptive kind of HR people and operational systems. So that's the sort of success story that I like the most. So how do we do it? The challenge, bring the senior leaders into a space where they're comfortable that actually they can build this gradually, but create some space where we can try it out. Communicate to everybody, try and get involvement on a voluntary basis, deliver the training, which kind of gets people comfortable with this approach and method and language, get product owner roles sorted, build MVPs and next viable products and test and iterate, make sure retrospectives are really what they're there to do and are really strongly used and spread across the teams that are working in this way. And just create this core that can expand and replicate this training to their colleagues, so that actually you get this proliferation that isn't dependent on a consultant like me. It's people who are sharing and learning as they're doing, so that the agile philosophy, I suppose, of you learn it by doing it is definitely how they roll it out. And there's a sort of an average timeline. We come in week 1. What does it need to interact with? We design the approach, we deliver the skills, we deploy it. So within 3 weeks, we're out of the way. And then in months 3, 6 and 12, we help evaluate the impact and make sure that things are going as they should do. And that's it. That's our approach. There's the new book, slightly plugged. There's the team. And I'll stop and take a breath and see if there's any questions.
Amazing. Thank you, Perry. We have had quite a few questions coming through, actually, so I'm not sure whether we'll be able to answer them all right now, but I'll read the first one out and then I'll paste them all into the chat, so then you can look at them, Perry, and pick some out. So the first question is from Aga, and they ask, many large organizations want to become more agile, but it's hard to execute because of HR. People have to be in specific lines and it's hard to change roles internally. So as you help HR to become more agile, does that reflect in the business becoming more agile themselves, business agility?
Completely. So, yeah, I mean, a short answer to that is if you start with HR, you are removing one of the inhibitors to the rest of the organization becoming more HR. That's notwithstanding the fact that sometimes leaders are still quite hoarding over their resource and don't want it to sort of go out and work on these crazy corporate agile projects. So you need a strong lead from the top that says, look, they're not your resource, they're our resource. If they're working on something that's an agile project, that's because the organization needs it. You've got to let them do that and cover their absences. And HR needs to kind of hold a strong line on that too. But I think if you start with HR, you create a different sense of what's possible in how you deploy and move people around. So top team, real strong sponsor, and HR, that's a pretty powerful force for having the whole organization be able to adopt a more agile approach.
Awesome. I've popped the next question in the chat.
Cool. Okay. So is that Arabella? That one there?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah. Have you seen true outliers of the companies you've worked with in terms of moving away from traditional once a year? Performance development and bell curve rating. Right. Okay. Yeah. So this is another HR system, isn't it, that we need to completely look at, and we could take an agile solution to it, which is performance management, and how we have, some high achievers in a small percentage, a big hump of very decent average people, and then a bottom end of people who really you ought to do without. And in the Steve Ballmer days at Microsoft, you would fire. I just don't think it's that simple anymore. And I think we are in a situation now where I think the point of review that's been the line manager has inculcated that hoarding mentality and almost asked people to create that strong link to the manager because they're the one who writes their report and gives them their bonus. So some form of dispersal of feedback is a great way to start, where people own their own performance development and they take it where they go. So if they work on a squad with a coach, they get some feedback from that, and that's brought into their review. And then, you know, you can have a sort of multi-point approach, I guess. There are software platforms that help with that. So Glint and some other performance management applications can be open to anybody to provide feedback on anybody. But I think we've got to break the link that performance management is done by a manager and their team member. I think it's a kind of an every person's kind of responsibility to give feedback and guidance and build a case for anything to do with kind of peer or recognition. But the performance is owned by the individual. It's my job, it's my role. I'll collect it, I'll curate it, I'll bring it to a point where at some point then there'll be somebody who has an influence on my career who I can take that to and lodge and say, this is how I perform. Lots of people have junked performance reviews, replaced them with regular conversations. One of my clients, River Island, has brought in kind of career conversations rather than performance development. So they're not about metrics on performance, they're more about capability for future potential. I quite like them for that still. So I put some pressure on HR to come up with something more inventive that's fairer, equitable, and is owned by the individual. That's probably where I'd go with that. Cool. Is that another one there, Amani? What advice is given to HR on uncovering better ways to hire agile roles? Really important point. I mean, you know, I've worked with a lot of HR teams who have got, you know, like an e-commerce team or something, or a team of techies who provide the support for infrastructure and so on. And they tend to kind of outsource quite a bit of that recruitment because they're not specialists in that field. They haven't got a network. And even worse when we're talking about things like agile teams and scrum masters and so on. So I think HR getting into that game and understanding a lot more about the characteristics, the behaviors, the traits, the personalities, the skill levels needed to recruit in that space is pretty vital. So what I've encouraged clients to do is that if an HR person is involved in the recruitment of somebody in a specialist area like agile working, that they go spend time with that team and they understand the dynamic, the need, the challenges, and not just rely on a kind of competency profile and a really steady sort of mandate on fixed job description things. So yeah, definitely spend time with that environment and understand it more. And then do it, you know, when you start to operate and work in that space. I think you've got a lot more empathy with those people who are operating in those roles. So I think we need to get a lot cuter about, you know, product managers, business analysts, all those kind of things. They're not straightforward operational type roles. They're very complex, they're very specialist, and they're kind of emerging. So there's a need, I think, to work with that community to create a stronger sense of what are we looking for, how do we find it, and how do we reward it, how do we keep it, how do we develop it, that kind of thing. I don't think HR can do that on its own. Cool. Louisa, can you introduce Agile into HR if the senior management team have limited understanding of it? Right, yeah. Some senior teams still fit into the not developed here space. Yeah, it's a real problem. So when I go in, it's normally because there's already a fairly strong belief that Agile is going to help people. So I'm sort of brought in because there's a curiosity or indeed an intent to do it. I have been brought in where there isn't that same intent, where there are people who are like, I'm skeptical, I don't believe it, I'm not sure about it. So I think the question Louisa puts in there is where you just need to find that one person who can hold the space and say, let's experiment in a safe way with something that can reveal whether this is suitable for the kind of organization we are, with the kind of customer base and I suppose sort of parameters that we operate in, and try and experiment and reveal, and then take that to people who are perhaps a bit skeptical and say, look, this is not an imposed system, this is our adaptation, and we have proven how it can work, and we now want to start to scale up and replicate this. If you just went into a leadership team and said, right, you need safe, and that's what you need, they'd just go, what and why? And I did hear about a financial services organization who will remain nameless, who just went full scale and said, let's do Agile. not really justifying why, and train lots of people, and then wondered why it didn't work. Because it was just an imposed thing that was considered a little bit of a sort of panacea, and not built and not owned and not administered by people there. It was inflicted upon them. So I think that's how I do it, Louise. I would bring it in with somebody who at least is curious enough to try it out and reveal some evidence and experiments. When you tell people it's 4x faster, that it includes diverse range of people, that actually people get more fulfillment. I mean, I've had people who've told me that in the 23 years they've worked in that organization, this is the best experience they've ever had. That's pretty compelling stuff. Okay, Simon, in today's situation, do you think HR transformations of the type you are describing will be harder because traditional HR spaces are very comfortable to people? People don't like change in periods of stress. Yes. So ironically, Simon, I think there are two bits at play here. There are people who are anxious about the future because it's been disrupted with coronavirus, who are shrinking back to what they knew and are trying to hold that space and say, this is where I'm safe and comfortable. I want to keep it here. And then you've got a group of people who are like, well, all bets are off. It's all going to change. I might as well use this as a juncture to now create a transformative way of working remotely, of delivering learning development, and so on and so forth. So I think we've almost got a polarity of views there. Those people that are shrinking have a reason, and those people that are shrinking are probably in need of some I guess comforting sort of sense of what's possible. So be gentle with those people, but allow them to understand how they could be transformed and could use things like Agile to help them cope with a better future. They'll think it's dangerous, but it's dangerous now. And this is a tactic to help them with more responsiveness. Those people that are really up for it, almost get them to fill their boots, give them some real good challenges to work on, and give this methodology a real kick, even with a dispersed workforce. Get them to focus on high quality outcomes, high impact, high value, and make sure they're doing some really strong reviews on not just what product they deliver, but how they did it, and use that to help bring other people into that space because they've been the early adopter and the experimenter and they've proven the concept. So I think that's what I do to that one. Cool. Thank you, Simon. Jen, I have a question about culture. I work for a support function, not HR, but similar, and we're looking to move to the self-management model. Yeah, I've actually got a lot of pushback from the team. They don't see what needs to change or how an agile mindset will make their work fulfilling. So my question is, how do you deal with resistance where teams are stuck in the old way of doing it? Oh, Jen, that is such a classic question. I actually made some big mistakes of my own in the early 2010s when I worked with the learning development team, and I really wanted them to be self-managed and much more agile and use Scrum. And I thought, I'm excited about it. I'm sure they will too. And they were a bit terrified because they had to step into an accountable space they weren't used to. And they were quite comfortable that when stuff got hard, they gave it to me as the team leader and said, well, this is your pay grade, off you go. And I was saying to them in the future, don't use me as some kind of battering ram or whatever, because if you've got the relationship with the client and you're kind of stuck, then actually you're better placed than I am to know the backstory and the reason why there's resistance. You're probably better placed to deal with it. But they didn't like it because they thought that that was exposing them to some danger that they wanted me to be like a human shield for. So that was a really important lesson for me. People, just because you've got a liberated sense of something, they won't all buy it. They won't all go, oh, this is great, isn't it? Because they'll think, well, I've got more risk to manage now. I'm more accountable. And they don't like to step into that space sometimes. They're quite happy to hide a bit behind a management structure. So I think it's almost like we have to tease out with people, what is it you're uncomfortable about the work you do now, and try and work on those kind of things and unearth some problems that they're having that actually a self-managed or more autonomous or more agile solution is going to help them with. So it's not quite you reverse engineer it, but I think you need to get the heart of what problems they're having before you can start to think that some kind of self-managed system is going to work for them. So be dialogic, be gentle, and start to think about things that are going to make a difference to them. And yeah, I think even with self-management, it might sound like it's a thing you can just declare and it happens. There are a lot of reluctance in it because it's not quite what people are used to. Yeah. Great question, Jen. I think that's it.
There's one more if you want to take another one, Perry, but I'm aware of time. But is there a way that people can contact you after this? Because you do still have quite a few outstanding questions.
Goodness, yes, indeed there are. So, so I'm on Twitter at Perry Timms. I am reachable by email, perry@pthr.co.uk. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not difficult to find. There's only one of me. So if you Google me, tons of stuff comes up. I'm totally happy to copy the questions and kind of do a response, and maybe the Agile Centre can push it out as a kind of blog post or something. I'm quite happy to do that. I did find a lot to share with you then, so I didn't quite leave as much room as I'd hoped for some questions, but I'm glad that people have put them in the chat room so that we can preserve them and send them out. But I'm also hoping that people have kind of walked away from this kind of going, wow, this tech product build thing in a complex culture and HR environment does sound like it's got a lot to offer, and I'm happy to talk about it more to people on that basis. So yeah, totally.
Awesome. So we'll collate all the questions, guys. We'll get Perry's answers and we'll send them back out. Thank you.
Awesome. Fantastic. Is that us done?
Fantastic. And 1 minute past 8, look at that. So Perry, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I had to hold myself back for most of that from jumping in. I wanted to dip deep into it, but that's not easy for me to do. But so thank you. I really enjoyed that. Really, really important we bring HR along on this journey and transform that along with everything else. So I'm going to let you go back to your evening. Thank you so much for spending your Thursday evening with us. We appreciate that, and thank you, Perry. Next month, we don't quite have a date yet, absolutely. We don't quite have a date, but we have Sean Cooney, who heads up an engineering department in government, and he's going to be talking about organisational design and change in government, and I can't wait to hear that. We'll let you know as soon as we have a date. And in June, the month after, we're going to have my friend and fellow Scrum Alliance board member, Saurabh Salimi, talking. I don't know what he's talking about, but it's going to be awesome. So tune in for that. We'll get the details out as quickly as we can. We'll also send some stuff out just to let you know where you can watch this back because we've been recording it. All right, so thank you for turning up. Thank you for your questions. Thank you, Perry. Keep your eyes peeled for next month and the month after that. And stay safe and enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Thank you, folks. Signing off.
Thanks, Green. Thanks, Mika.
Cheers.
Thank you.